The way that I would define Zionism is through, of course, my education, but also really thinking about how the word is used in the world. It's a very big word, and it's a word that I teach to my students because they have to understand what anti-Semitism is when I teach them Judaism or the section on Judaism, and then we talk about not just the modern contemporary times, but we also talk about 1600s, and we talk about the 1700s and 1800s. And then we end up doing a whole section on Theodor Herzl and political Zionism. We talk about cultural Zionism. We talk about theological Zionism. So there's very different ways of looking at Zionism, but the way that I would broadly define it is that there were ways of approaching Zion, which is home in Israel, and particularly Jerusalem, for people throughout the centuries. It was not just post-Holocaust, it was not just pre-Holocaust, but it was always there. And when you look at the historical aspect of what Israel is today, or Zion is today, it was Judea. And there were people, there were Jews there always that were residing there, that were expelled there, that were exiled. There were different movements going on. So Zionism, to me, is a movement, whether it's political, cultural, or religious, that calls forth for Jews to believe in a homeland, which is today Israel, a place where they can be and be protected by their own nation. But also, if you look at Herzl's own writings, if you look at his own diary, if you look at his book, The Jewish State, he talks about how creating a Jewish state is only viable if we can live peacefully with one another. And so Zionism is not a dirty word for me. Zionism it can be a positive word, but it has been seen as something that is very ideological and is tied to a nationalism, and it's lost its kind of nuance that it always had for me, at least. So I teach Zionism in a historical way. I show the kinds of anti-Semitism that Jews experience, especially in places like Russia, and talk about Herzl, and I talk about Pinsker, and I talk about Potak, and I talk about the ideas, why they were there. And students are more interested in that because it's a different time. They start to realize that anti-Semitism is not a new form of racism, that it's been there for a long time, and I think that's the important thing to do in terms of Zionism. We tend to think in fragments. We don't think of a continual history of, say, the Jewish people, or even the Muslim people, or even Christians. We tend to think in these fragments, these modern ways that have fragmented us as people. And I think Zionism was a way for people to also look for and hope for a place where they could call their own. Theologically, it is in some Jewish communities, some Orthodox communities, and Hasidic communities, it has been a place prescribed by God as a promised land, which Christians and Muslims cannot see, cannot understand, because in Christianity and in Islam, the promised land or heaven is celestial. It's not here. It's not physical. It's not material. Whereas in Judaism, it has a different valence.